And then Julie's thing.
We'll save it for later. You're so mean.
We'll talk about later. No, it's
Fine.
the great thing there is, what can you imagine? You know, if you can come up with a need for a form to do something that none of the other things can cover, SharePoint framework extension.
All right, let's get started. It is June 12th. This is Ask in Praxis. Welcome, everybody. I believe we have a full contingent with the exception of Todd, but I don't like when Todd gets to speak anyway. So the fact that he's not here and I don't have to like mute him just is all the better. So no Todd today, but
no PowerShell.
No
That's what I
PowerShell.
came here for.
I can stand in
Well,
for
then
Todd.
you have to leave. No,
We're only going to talk about
No PowerShell for
PowerShell
you.
just because Todd's not here. We're talking about only PowerShell. That's it.
Perfect.
No, we're going to talk about form options for SharePoint and Microsoft lists. That's what we're doing today. I forget, Mark, you brought this up, but brought to you by the letter S. What the heck was that? Can anybody
There was a reason that we thought that was, it was hysterically funny.
But that was last Friday, and I'm old
Sesame
and I
Street?
can't remember these. Sesame Street, but I know, but why S?
We
Why
had
S?
a
SharePoint?
specific.
SharePoint.
No,
it wasn't SharePoint.
No, it was something
wasn't.
about this stuff.
Praxis.
No,
Oh, good.
no.
You're doing well.
Nothing
We're not
so
doing well.
obvious. Nothing
Yeah,
so
it wasn't.
obvious.
Oh, well,
Well,
it doesn't
anyway,
matter. It was
Today
funny.
is brought to you by the letter S.
We're going to talk about SharePoint lists, libraries, and Microsoft Forms, and then the form options that you have. So that's our agenda. Mark is going to kick us off. Todd was going to kick us off, but since I muted him and removed him from the thing, Mark is taking over. So Mark, help us learn about forms.
So, what is a form? I actually think there's always been a lot of confusion of what a form is, and so really, to me, and I think in the context of this discussion, forms are a place where you collect data. Not anything that happens after you hit the submit button or the save button, but the form itself, the place that the data gets collected. You know, historically, like if you worked with InfoPath, for example, a form was not just that collection, but the whole container, and that I think has confused people over the years. So then, usually separated from the subsequent processing. So, you know, the data that you collect in that form might go into a list, might go into a database, it might go who knows where. It doesn't really matter in the sense of the form itself. I think it's also important to note that lists and libraries do not have the same form options. Some of them overlap, but a lot of them don't. And the reason for that is the historical reason of that. I love that little cartoon. You know, the lists and library capabilities were originally developed by different teams at Microsoft, and that separation seems to sort of come together and go apart over time. Because it's different people building those experiences in lists and libraries, the way forms work are not the same. So that's a bit of an inconsistent experience. Some end users notice that right away. Some don't ever care about it. They just don't think about it. But just because there's a document in place doesn't mean, or as sort of a document-centric form, doesn't mean that the form capabilities would inherently have to be different, but they are.
I think that's even more exasperated now that we're seeing the SharePoint lists experience be replaced by Microsoft lists, which is dependent on any customizations you have on as to whether you see that or not. But that change, I think, is exasperating the situation because they're so now different. The SharePoint list experience, if you're looking at it as an embedded Microsoft list versus a SharePoint library, is so significantly different. And it's kind of ridiculous that they are, because I mean, one is just that there's a link to a document versus not. Otherwise, they're exactly the same user experience, or should be the same.
Should be is the operative phrase there.
Although,
Exactly.
although I will argue that the user's process when interacting with those forms is different.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
So with a list, you're going to the list with the express intent of adding or editing an item in that list. Versus with a document library, you're going there. Your primary intent is to either read a document or add a document.
Or
So,
edit a document.
or edit. It's document centric versus metadata centric.
No, that's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Yep. Because they built it that way. But yeah.
Well, we could argue about the
chicken and egg.
but
I mean,
let's not go there.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's move on then. Mark and Carrie did some nice work here to build us some form option grids. So
Yeah. So
maybe the two of you can explain this to these fine people.
So, I mean, I think the summary here is the forms canvas has gotten more and more complicated. There are more options now than there used to be. We're talking primarily about lists here, but not really, because there's some overlap. Generally, from the top to the bottom is simpler to more complicated. And that somewhat will depend on your skill set. You know, to Julie, doing an SPFx form customizer is probably easier than doing an out-of-the-box form. But generally speaking, to your average human. I'll do one, Carrie, and then maybe you can try. Well, actually, I'll let you do the first one. Putting you on the spot.
Put me on the spot. So this is really where I landed for much of what I've worked on with this, because I haven't really used a ton of these, and for the reasons that people are generally just looking for some simple tracking, right? So the out of the box stuff is where I've sort of been in that space of like, I have issues I need to track. And so, you know, it's a good space for that. Things like vacation requests, very simplistic, minimal columns like you're seeing here with the scenarios. And it's just all basically part of that list. So it's great because you can enter this stuff and then you have it in a list and you can use views and do all the things. So that's kind of where I've landed with the forms. It's just been more on the simple side of things. And it's great for that, but it can be a little bit too simplistic, which is part of some of those cons. And that's kind of where I think it tends to fall short.
So when you have a plain old out of the box form and it has more than 3 or 4 or 5, whatever the number might be, columns, you might want to start to rearrange it a little bit. Maybe group those columns together into sections, for example. And that's where out of the box with form customizations can be handy. You can change the header, you can change the footer, and you can change how the columns are laid out in that form and give section headers. So it's not tremendously complicated formatting, but it can really help with the readability of a form. And usually when you have a list with more than, again, making up a number, 5, 10, whatever the number is, columns, they sort of fall into groups. And so being able to do that in the form is quite helpful. It's JSON driven. So to most people, that's developer land. JSON is not human readable stuff. There are lots and lots of samples out there, but if you don't want exactly what the sample does, you're going to have to learn some JSON syntax, which can be difficult. So think of that as lists that get a little bit more complicated and just would benefit from a little bit of rearranging. The next thing is the new magical forms, and the fact that they've called it forms will undoubtedly not cause any confusion whatsoever. There's a new
Tara
button.
was just saying this in the chat. She was having, exactly. I love how she worded it, syntactically challenging. Such a nice way to say it.
Yes. This is part of that different groups build things at Microsoft without talking to each other. Now there's a new forms button on the toolbar in the modern list, sorry, not the modern list view, the brand new list view where the views are across the top in the tabs.
Microsoft lists view.
Yes. So this is, and by the way, SharePoint lists and Microsoft lists are the same thing with a different UI. So I should have said that up front. So these forms are nice because they're directly connected to the SharePoint list. They know the schema of the list. They know this is a date. They know this is a choice column. You can take that form and share it separately from the list. The people filling out the form don't even have to know that the list exists. So in that sense, it's sort of like Microsoft Forms, but we'll talk about that in a second. So the thing that makes this distinct is it is connected to the schema of that list, separates the data collection from the underlying list, and you can share it with a link. You can't do any branching. It's still a form that you go through from top to bottom. And you can embed these forms. Derek taught me this morning. I did not know this. You can use the embed web part and embed one of these forms with an iframe into a SharePoint page, which is really nice.
The only caveat there is that it does need to be in the same, like it needs to be in SharePoint. You can't use that a form from a Microsoft list because the domain, you get a cross-domain error.
Right. So the scenario here is where your data collection is separated from process management. So for example, in HR, if you want to, have a change the title, change your title form or paid time off form, you can collect that data. It disappears. The person who fills it out doesn't even know where it goes. And then that list can live in a different site, in a different wherever, and be managed through the process.
Yeah, and Dan points out that there's a limited supported number of column types at the moment too. So there's
that's right.
That aspect. Yep.
Which ones doesn't it? Which ones are not supported, Dan?
Management of data. I was gonna guess that. Not that I would know, but I was gonna guess it.
I actually thought I saw that work. So I'm okay. I believe you. Okay, so that's forms on Microsoft Lists. Now or Microsoft List Forms, which is not to be confused with the Microsoft List Forms in rows 1 and 2. The next thing is Microsoft Forms. So Microsoft Forms were actually developed by Microsoft Education for use in an education context, so quizzes and surveys and things like that. That's why they contain branching, anonymous entry, and they've got a little bit more, quite a bit more robustness for make the logic change based on previous answers. So that's part of what the branching brings you. They're not connected to SharePoint lists. They are just a separate standalone thing, but you can take the output, or you can take the data that was entered and move it into a list with Power Automate, but it's more work. You can also set the ownership of a Microsoft form to a group, and then the responses can be synced to an Excel file in the group's team site, which is a nice sort of simpler way of collecting that data that's entered without having to write Power Automate or build a list. It just goes into an Excel file. These can be embedded in SharePoint pages with, and I have that in both columns, with the Microsoft Forms web part. So that's a different web part than the embed web part. It's purpose-built just for Microsoft Forms. If you look at the new Forms thing on lists and Microsoft Forms, and you aren't a developer, you look at them and you think, oh, these are exactly the same. They look the same, but they're not at all. They're built totally differently under the covers. And so that's why we see differences in the capabilities and differences in the logic once we start understanding them.
I hadn't heard, Krista put in the chat that the new list forms experience creates unique permissions on the underlying list. I hadn't heard that. I know that the list forms experience is saved in a hidden view on the list, but I didn't know that it creates unique permissions, and I would want to know more about that. That seems concerning and odd, and I don't understand that, but.
I had
expanded on that.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just saying Krista expanded on that. So
Oh,
she
yeah,
did?
I added an additional note in the chat about that. I've been working with Microsoft on it. I did some testing in my tenant, and it creates, basically, if you give someone, or if they get access to the list URL on the SharePoint site, they can open it, they can see all the column headings. They can't see any of the data, but they can export the list structure. They can see all the public views in terms of whatever your column headings are. So if you only show 5 columns in your form and you have 10 columns in your list, all 10 are going to be visible to the people. And in the back end, it automatically switches on unique permissions for the list. They can request sharing of the list with other people. There's a whole lot of stuff, and Microsoft says that is by design. That's their response to my support inquiry that I had going with them on that.
Yeah, we had heard that there was going to be some sharing options, but I didn't know that that was already available, and so that's interesting. That's surprising.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that with this new forms thing, it's early. It's rolled out to all tenants apparently as of just last few weeks. But I think Microsoft has done sort of their minimum viable product approach here, and they're getting feedback like yours, Krista, and I expect there will be changes coming.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. I think it's part of the danger of having different teams build things that already exist and not necessarily having learned from the mistakes in the past. Or from the better practices in the past. Next one.
PowerApps.
PowerApps. So, and it occurs to me that I'm talking way too much because the next slides are going to be sort of what repeat of what I'm talking about. But PowerApps are a way to build not just forms, but actual full solutions. They're not generally used as a separation of the form and the business process. They generally combine the two together. So yes, you may have a form as part of a Power App, but you generally may also have lots more business logic in them. So it's a separate tool set. It's a different learning experience. It's supposedly low code, though you end up writing a lot of code-like things when you're writing a Power App. If you want to write a Power App that actually does a lot of work for you. And then Julie's thing.
We'll save it for later. You're so mean.
We'll talk about later. No, it's the great thing there is, what can you imagine? If you can come up with a need for a form to do something that none of the other things can cover, SharePoint framework extension can do it.
Did you want to say anything more about out-of-the-box forms? We have a nice picture here.
Yeah, I stole that from Laura Rogers.
Nice.
I
Nice
posted
example.
it. I posted it in the chat. But the other thing you can do with out-of-the-box forms is you can show and hide fields conditionally, which is something that we used to need to write JavaScript for back in the SP services days. We can, you can say if a dropdown equals X, then show or hide field Y. And you can do that to create a little bit better of a user experience and not have fields on the form that users don't necessarily need to fill out.
Yeah, that's a good one.
That's right. Sorry about that. That should be on there.
Well, it can't be completely.
They aren't cascading dropdowns, Caleb.
Yes, they are.
All right, and then this is visual of the. We're just gonna go with list forms. Is that what we're gonna go with? This is.
It's hard to know what to actually call it because the button on the top says forms, and then of course there's the other button under Power Apps that says customize forms.
Yeah.
Not the same thing, small f, big F. I think Microsoft is calling these custom list forms.
Okay.
Right?
We try to Google that.
I mean, we've heard them say that, but at the same time, you have list forms that can be customized. So
maybe that's a good use case for Bing. Maybe Bing will know the answer where Google doesn't.
I'm sure that AI will cover this. So one other thing about this kind of form is you can have multiple forms per list. So you could have a different form linked in a two different places. If you have different ways that you want people to come in to the form. I haven't come up with a good use case for that in my mind, but I'm sure that there are some. And I think I've already talked about all of that stuff.
All right, you talked about all that stuff. Derek,
All
tell us
right.
more about PowerApps.
So the thing about PowerApps that's different from all the different all the other options we talked about is that one of the big drivers is that you can create different display screens based on which form you're trying to fill out. So if you're a new form versus an edit form versus a view form, you can create different screens based on that. You can also create different screens based on where the item is in the process. So if you have, say, a loan application and certain fields are visible when it's at status X, you can create different conditional logic to do that you can't do in the out-of-the-box stuff. The challenge there is that it does, create a fair amount of complex code to show and hide things based on that logic. And as Mark said, it is intrinsically tied to the list that you're in. Plus side, though, is that if you have an E3 or above, it is included in the license. So you're not building a Power App that sort of stands alone. You're basically creating a Power App front end to the list, just like the form. It is intrinsically tied to that list, so it's not reusable. The other thing that I wanted, so you can see in the image here, all I did was create a conditional header that shows different fields, whether or not the task is overdue or not. But you could actually go really deep and create very custom applications built on that and different forms and different field values. The downside is and I forget the exact name of this, the details panel. It's what happens when you click the little eye. Both the details panel, the Power Apps don't work in the details panel, and they also don't work or prevent users from changing things in grid view. So if the idea here is to hide or obfuscate certain fields in your list, just know that there are ways around that depending on how the users interact with the forms.
That actually reminds me that I didn't check for grid view. So while Derek tells you more about Microsoft Forms, I'm going to just go double check that answer.
So yeah, Mark already gave a list talked about Microsoft Forms, but essentially it's for data entry only. One of the interesting things that you can do is provide anonymous access. So you could, run a survey in the street and just collect data. It's a good choice if you're doing multi-step forms where you have to have the user save and interact partway through. You can also do limited branching activities. But the thing here is that the data is essentially stored outside of SharePoint. And so it doesn't have a really good, how do I want to say this, data integrity, I guess, story. It's basically served in a table somewhere. And if you say launch a form, and then you want to revise the form, and you want to revise the form, and you want to remove a field, all the data that's in that field is gone.
Yeah, so didn't that happen to Emily?
It did. Emily
time.
created a form, and she had changed something in it, but she dropped a field and lost all the data. And not just on new data, it's historical data.
Yeah, it was so good.
You can export the data out of forms and get it into Excel. But essentially, if you want to connect it with SharePoint, you need to use a flow to do that. And so the other thing you could do is create a QR code for the form as well, which you can do that right in the tool, or if you have your own custom QR code reader tool, you can use that as well. Yes, Caleb, you are correct. It has to be paired with Power Automate to feed it into SharePoint. So
yeah, that's not a thing yet. Krista asked if there's any word on reCAPTCHA options coming for forms. I remember that request. I haven't heard anything though.
I haven't heard anything about that either. I did hear about it, but I don't think it is I do not think
Yeah.
that is it. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't recommend throwing a publicly accessible Microsoft Forms with a link out there on the internet. But if you want to use it in a sort of walled garden kind of way, you can actually create like an anonymous survey.
Yeah.
So.
And I think that can be really useful. We've used it for conferences and stuff before, so it can be handy.
Yep. Yep.
All right, my thing. So the SharePoint
Julie's
Framework Form
thing.
Customizer is your full code solution. Unlike the PowerApps thing, you have a sort of different experience, and I did just double check, and I do have all the answers now. I'm good like that. All right, so the way that a form customizer works is that it's associated with a content type. So it can be the default content type in a list, but you have to you essentially under the covers modify the content type that's on the list's content type. Although you can do this at like the site content level or the content type hub level and make this association, but essentially you're overriding and saying, here's the GUID of the SharePoint framework solution that I want you to use for lists, for the new edit and view lists for this particular content type. And so then if you only have that content type in that library, you've sort of now locked that down to only use your custom dev experience. And of course, because it's, you know, front end dev, you can do absolutely anything you want on that form. And I've explained before when we previous versions of Ask and Praxis, when I've done like custom security in the forms and whatever, and that can be accomplished because you're very limited on how you can modify that data once you have the form customizer in place. So when you click on the, you can tell from that upper image there, when you click on the new button, or when you click on the open or edit drop down in the context menu from the item, or when you go to the information panel, the little eye over there, and click edit all of those takes you to a new page that is a single app part page with the form rendered in there. Depending on which action the person picked, it tells SharePoint Framework, hey, this was a new, requesting new, this was requesting view, this was requesting edit, and then you can do whatever you want with that. It doesn't mean you have to show them an edit experience. If you don't want them to have an edit experience when they click edit, you can make decisions based on the data in the form, other permission sort of concerns, like are they in a particular Microsoft 365 group or something like that. So you have a lot of ability to change what's happening. The one thing that they can do, oh, and grid view is not available here. The one thing that they can do, and this has changed sometime between January of 2023 and now, this changed, but it used to be that when you open the information panel and you selected something, you would just see the details about like modified, but you wouldn't actually see all the fields. And now you do. You can't change any of them. They're all disabled. So it's not like the traditional edit experience, but you do see all the values. That was not the case before. So if that concerns you, you are still limited in that way. So that is the SharePoint framework thing. And that sort of wraps us up for all the ways that we can provide form experience to SharePoint lists and to a certain extent libraries. Here's some resources. Got some links. Laura Rogers, wonderful MVP in the community, has done some does some speaking on this topic. Derek also does a great session on this topic. So if you're ever out and about and seeing us at conferences, and Derek's doing one on forms, that's what he's covering. So lots of great information and links here. And then last but not least, as usual, see us live. So we'll be at TechCon 365 DC. That's Derek, myself, and Mark, and that's August 12th through 16th. So if you're interested in joining us there, we have that $100 off coupon you can use. Collab Days New England people, for all our New England people, come to Collab Days New England. We're doing it on Friday this year because we're cool like that and people want to take off work and not come out on their weekends. So we're going to do it that way. October 18th in Burlington, Mass at the MTC there.
I can't get that day off.
Yeah, you can. I gave it to you.
Oh, yeah,
everyone's going to be there but Todd. We are cutting Todd out again. I'm doing good at this. We're keeping him out of everything. That's my goal for life. So we have the call for speakers that's open till the end of June. So if you would like to speak, if you're a new speaker, you know, but you're interested in getting into the community and doing presentations, reach out to Mark if you're concerned about it, but just submit your topics. Mark will help you work through that if you need a little bit of support, but that is open. And if you know any organizations, maybe the organization you work for that would be interested in sponsoring us, we are absolutely looking for that. ESPC will be in December in Stockholm, and Mark, Derek, and Patrick will be there. So next time we'll see you June 26th, and we're going to go into what is SharePoint Premium. And I hope you all can attend and join us there. All right, everybody, thanks for your attendance, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Ask and Praxis. We love getting your questions or session ideas. You can submit by using the link in About. If you find this helpful, hit that like or subscribe button and share this content with your colleagues.